Well, let's get started, shall we?
Yeah.
Lord, tonight we're privileged again to open your word, to partake of what you have for us. I pray you'll bless your word as it goes out, anoint my lips to say those things that you'd have said, anoint our hearts to receive, and we thank you in Jesus' name.
Amen.
All right, tonight we're going to start a new book. We're going to start going through Judges. Judges is a different book. It has some exciting stuff in it, and it has some really, really dull stuff in it. There were 21 chapters.
Here they come.
Okay, here they come. There's 21 chapters in Judges. So we'll try to...
Sorry.
It's all right. We'll try...
He hasn't started yet, so you're okay.
All right. We're going to try to keep this relatively easy. I don't want to get into all the history of every battle and who everybody was. I may mention a few key characters as we go through. I may even combine some chapters because some of them are just battles, and we'll just blow through those pretty much. But I want to, tonight, I want to lay some groundwork tonight. So we're going to go into a little more detail on some of this first chapter. And we'll outline the book and look at it. So start with, now some of this I'm going to read to you because it's pretty good. I copied it. I plagiarized this from some of my commentary. But the book of Judges is the seventh book of the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Old Testament. In the narrative of the Hebrew Bible, it covers the time between the conquest described in the book of Joshua and the establishment of a kingdom in the books of Samuel, during which biblical judges served as temporary leaders. Now let me explain a little bit because this is going to be a little confusing as we get into these first chapter. You'll remember Joshua crossed the Jordan River. He destroyed Jericho. Walls fell down, and he went on to conquer the cities. Well, we're going to find now that this is the time when the tribes are supposed to go out and take possession of that land. Joshua led the armies and they defeated these people. But then what happened? Well, as they were taking the whole army and defeating all of these different lands, they just moved in behind them, okay? And so now it was time for the tribes to go out and not just defeat them, but move in. Move them out. You're gone, you know. This is and anyway, it's what we're trying to do with some of these people we have, you know, deport them, that's my word. We're going to deport them back where they came from. So that's what they were supposed to do, is deport them out and move in. And that's what we're going to look at as a summary or overview in this first chapter of how well that went. And then when we get into chapter 2, we're going to see how God reacted to the situation. And then in chapter 3, we'll start to get into detail about the judges and what they did and so forth. So that's kind of a quick summary of what we're going to be looking at here. The stories follow a consistent pattern. The people are unfaithful to Yahweh, and he therefore delivers them into the hands of their enemies. The people repent and entreat Yahweh for mercy, which he sends in the form of a leader or champion, which is called the judge. The judge delivers the Israelites from oppression, and they prosper. But soon they fall again into unfaithfulness, and the cycle is repeated. Scholars consider many of the stories in Judges to be the oldest in the Deuteronomistic history, with their major redaction dated to the 8th century BCE, and with material such as the Song of Deborah dating from much earlier. So what they're saying here, when we talk about the Deuteronomistic history, we're talking about history in the light of the book of Deuteronomy. And so when you read Deuteronomy, God says, you know, if you'll serve me, if you'll you know, be consistent, serve me, do what I tell you to do, I'm going to give you the land, and you're going to have all of this land. And that's Deuteronomistic history. And so what it says is, all of Canaan belonged to Israel. Because that's what God said in the book of Deuteronomy. It's all yours. You're going to have it. You know, I gave it to Abraham. Abraham gave it to Isaac. Isaac gave it to Jacob. And now you're going to get it. And so that's what we're talking about. So we're going to look at this in light of Deuteronomistic history. And that's kind of an important way to look at this book. Now, Deuteronomy is conceived as a covenant or a treaty between the Israelites and Yahweh, who was chosen or elected, who has chosen or elected the Israelites as his people, and requires Israel to live according to his law. Israel is to be a theocracy, with Yahweh as the divine suzerain. The law is to be supreme over all other sources of authority, including kings and royal officers. And the prophets are to be the guardians of the law. Prophecy is instruction in the law as given through Moses. The law given through Moses is the complete and sufficient revelation of the will of God, and nothing further is needed. This is a definition of Deuteronomy history. Under the covenant, Yahweh has promised Israel the land of Canaan, but the promise is conditional. If the Israelites are unfaithful, they will lose the land. The Deuteronomistic history explains Israel's success and failures as the result of faithfulness, which brings success, or disobedience, which brings failure. As a result of unfaithfulness, which brings failure, the destruction of the kingdom of Israel by the Assyrians in 723 BC, and the kingdom of Judah by the Babylonians in 586, are Yahweh's punishment for continued sinfulness. Deuteronomy insists on the centralization of worship in the place that the Lord your God will choose. Deuteronomy never says where this place will be, but Kings make it clear that it is in Jerusalem, the books of Kings. It also shows a special concern for the poor, for widows and the fatherless. All Israelites are brothers and sisters, and each will answer to God for his treatment of his neighbor. This concern for equality and humanity extends also to the stranger who lives among the Israelites. The stranger is often mentioned in tandem with the concern for the widow and the orphans. Furthermore, there is a specific commandment to love the stranger. All right. So that defines the Deuteronomistic history. So when we look at what happens in the book of Judges, what we're looking at is what happened. I mean, it's a perfect, just exactly what God said was going to happen. When they were faithful, when they followed the law, they prospered. When they were unfaithful, didn't follow the law, didn't do what God said, they were not successful. I mean, it's as simple as that, and we're going to see this cycle over and over again. And it speaks to us today. If we do what God says and what He commands, we're successful. If we don't do what He says, we're not successful.
Right.
And so as a pastor, what that means is, you look at somebody who is constantly having difficulties. And the first thing the pastor does is he starts looking at their lives. I mean, he doesn't come, all right, sit down in that seat and tell me what's going on. But you know, you start kind of looking around to see what this person's doing, and all of a sudden you see where is their emphasis? What are they focused on? It's like I talked about yesterday. Where is their focus? Are they focused on God, or are they focused on what they're doing? And we're going to see the Israelites were focused on what they were doing, not focused on God. And they were unsuccessful. So it's a perfect example of what God has told us over and over again. If we just put our trust in Him, then He will take care of us, and we will be successful. When we become fearful, unbelieving, we don't put our trust in Him, or we begin to look at other things that are more attractive, down we go. So that's what we're going to be looking at as we move through this book. Now, we don't know who wrote the book. However, it ascribes the book, in most of tradition, to Samuel. But we don't know for sure. It's quite possible that Samuel assembled a lot of the accounts from the period of the Judges, that such prophets as Nathan and Gad, who were both associated with David's court, had a hand in shaping the final material. You know, we tend to look at the scriptures as some guy sat down and just wrote it out and that was it. We think about John on the Isle of Patmos, you know, that kind of thing. You just write, I'll tell you what, right, you just write it. Well, I believe that's exactly what happened to the book of Revelation. But when we get in the Old Testament, it's an entirely different arena. In the first place, all first 5 books of the Bible were written by Moses, 400 years after some of. And so where did he get the material? Did God sit him down and say, okay, I'll talk, you write? Or did he assimilate a lot of it from the lore that was there and what was handed down and put it together? Now, that doesn't mean it's not inspired. Absolutely not. It's just as inspired however it was done, because God blessed it and said it's inspired. If He says it's inspired, that's all I got to worry about. I don't care where He got it. But we sometimes, when we see commentaries and we see this kind of comment, we think we want to immediately say, well, that's not right. Yeah, it could very well be right. And we know that some of the book is not chronological order. It tells about things that may have happened out of chronological order, but it never says this is in chronological order. It's just telling stories that back up what the Word says. Okay? And it's the same thing we do today. If I'm going to write a sermon, that doesn't mean I'm going to tell you everything in chronological order. So we'll keep those things in mind. Now, the date of the composition is also unknown, but it was undoubtedly during the monarchy. In other words, during the time probably of Saul or perhaps David. The reason for that is the frequent expression, in those days Israel had no king. Okay, so that kind of says, today we got a king, but back when we didn't have a king, this is what happened. So it was probably written and compiled together during the time of the monarchy. The observation that the Jebusites still controlled Jerusalem, and this is in reference to chapter 1, verse 21, has been taken to indicate a time before David's capture of the city in 1000 BC. But the new conditions in Israel alluded to in chapters 17 and 21 suggest a time after the Davidic dynasty had been effectively established in the 10th century BC. So you can chew on that one and figure it out if you want. It's not germane, really. It's just there. All right, here's the outline of the book. The first prologue, okay, takes place in chapter 1, verses 1 through 36. That should be 36, not 3, 6. And it has 2 parts, and each serves a different purpose. They are not chronologically related, nor does either offer a strict chronological scheme of the time as a whole. So what we're looking at is not chronology involved. And this, as we go through it, I think you'll see why. Because there were several things that were happening at the same time. So how are you going to do that? One of the most interesting books I ever read was about the situation in Jerusalem. It's called Old Jerusalem in 1948. But the authors of this book, they were a man and a wife, they took the Arabs on one side and what this guy was doing at this particular time, and then at the same time, this is what this guy was doing at the same time from Israel. And they went through the whole time period people like Menachem Begin and some of these people that we, Golda Meir, what was she doing, different ones. And it was so interesting because they kept it in chronological order, but in order to do it, they had to have very short bursts of things. He was over here making a bomb for the hotel in Israel, and he was over here making a bomb headed for the hotel on the Arab side, but it was very interesting. But it was also a little difficult to follow because you had to take these snippets and try to remember what was he doing over here, now what was he doing when you come back over here, try to keep it lined up. But that's not how you do it. You usually take one full event or something going on, and then you say, now we're going to go back and see what this person was doing. So that's the way some of this works. All right. So we have two parts. They're not chronically related. The first part sets the stage, okay, historically. Now this first part, by the way, is the 1 through 36. It sets the stage historically for the narratives that follow. It describes Israel's occupation of the Promised Land from the initial success to their large-scale failure and divine rebuke. So I'm sorry, this first prologue then should be verses 1 to chapter 2, verse 6. I'm sorry, I had it right, it just should be 2 instead of a 3 on your paperwork there. So it's the first chapter, all 37 verses through the first 6 verses of chapter 2. Chapter 2. And it says 2 anyway.
I don't know where you're talking about.
See that again?
Yeah.
Okay, if we go back up to number 1, the first prologue should be chapter 1, verse 1, through chapter 2, verse 6. 2:6, okay? That gets us squared away here. All right, the second part goes from actually chapter 2, verse 7 through chapter 3, verse 6. It indicates a basic perspective on the period from the time of Joshua to the rise of the monarchy. All right? There's nothing to read. I'm reading it off my...
No, 2:7 to what?
3:6.
2:7.
Okay,
It's a time characterized by recurring cycles of apostasy, opposition, cries of distress, and gracious divine deliverance. The author summarizes and explains the Lord's dealing with his rebellious people and introduces some vocabularies and formulas he will use in the later narratives. All right, so we're laying out here God saying exactly what he's going to do, why he's going to do it, and what he's going to use to judge the people. One of them is did evil. It says they did evil in the eyes of the Lord. We'll see this constantly coming up. They did evil. So when God was judging them, he was judging them on the basis of evil. And this will become clear as we go through it. This we found did evil in chapter 2, verse 11. There's no giving you all these. You'll see them as we get there. Another one is he handed them over to. That's another phrase. They did evil in his eyes. He handed them over to the Pezerites or the Canaanites or the whoever. He handed them over to them. And finally sold them. So we'll see all these terms used throughout the book. Now the main body of the book starts in chapter 3, and it goes from verse 7 to chapter 16, verse 31. And this gives the actual accounts of the reoccurring cycle: apostasy, opposition, distress, and deliverance. It has its own unique design. Each cycle has a similar beginning. The Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and a recognized conclusion. The land had peace, years, or led Israel so on for years. All right. The first of these cycles provides the report form used for each successive story of oppression and deliverance. Boy, this is interesting stuff, isn't it? But it may seem boring, but it kind of gives us, when we get to it, you'll begin to see what I'm talking about. As we see the first one, we're going to see the form that's used. You know, if you're a secretary in a meeting and you're taking the minutes of the meeting, the form you use. Who called the meeting to attention? What was the time? Who was there? What was brought up to vote on? What was the vote? You have this form, and so you go through it. Well, that's kind of what this is, the same kind of thing. We're going to see this same form, this same point, as we go through these. All right, the remaining 5 cycles form the following narrative units, each of which focuses on one of the major judges. Ehud. Now, what about Ehud? We find him in chapter 3, verses 12 to 30. He was a lone hero from the tribe of Benjamin, who delivers Israel from opposition from the east. Now, this is, when we get to this, tonight as we go through, I want you to note the tribe of Benjamin and how effective as a tribe they were. It's interesting that a judge came out of that tribe. The second one is Deborah, chapters 4 to 5. And I think Deborah, to me, is a fantastic character. She's a woman from one of the Joseph tribes, either Ephraim or Manasseh, probably Ephraim, west of Jordan, who judges at a time when Israel is being overrun by a coalition of Canaanites under Sisera. Now, the reason I think Deborah is so interesting is because she's a woman. This was a time when women didn't do anything. I mean, they were not, everything was man, and all of a sudden you come to Deborah. What's Deborah? Why was Deborah used? She's an interesting character. And then we come to Gideon and his son Abimelech in chapters 6 through 9. This story forms the central account. In many ways, Gideon is the ideal judge, evoking memory of Moses, while his son is the very antithesis of a responsible and faithful judge. So we're going to take a look at this and see these two characters and how they did things. And then we have Jephthah, chapters 10, verses 6 to chapters 12, verse 7. He was a social outcast from the other Joseph tribe. Now this would be Manasseh, which was east of the Jordan River. All right, so we'll get into this here in just a minute. Who judges at a time when Israel is being threatened by a coalition of powers under the king of Ammon. And then the 8th judge is Samson, probably one of the, everybody knows about Samson. He was a lone hero from the tribe of Dan who delivers Israel from oppression from the west. And then we have the epilogue, which is chapter 17 to 21, and it characterizes the era in yet another way, depicting religious and moral corruption on the part of individuals, cities, and tribes. Like the introduction, it has 2 divisions that are neither chronologically related nor expressly related, or expressly dated to the specific judges. The events must have taken place, however, rather early in the period of the judges. All right, so we got all that stuff out of the way. Now you're all set. You got all the formation and foundation.
You bet.
So as we go through, you'll just click this stuff right off. Oh, I know, that's the form. All right. Well, let's start in. We're going to read Judges first, chapters 1 through 26. Now after the death of Joshua, it came to pass that the children of Israel asked the Lord, saying, Who shall be first to go up for us against the Canaanites to fight against them? And the Lord said, Judah shall go up. Indeed, I have delivered the land into his hand. So Judah said to Simeon, his brother, Come up with me to my allotted territory, that we may fight against the Canaanites. And I will likewise go with you to your allotted territory. And Simeon went with him. Then Judah went up, and the Lord delivered the Canaanites and the Perizzites into their hand, and they killed 10,000 men at Bezek. And they found Adoni-Bezek in Bezek, fought against him, and they defeated the Canaanites and the Perizzites. Then Adoni-Bezek fled, and they pursued him and caught him and cut off his thumbs and his big toes. And Adoni-Bezek said, 70 kings with their thumbs and big toes cut off used to gather scraps under my table. As I have done, so God has repaid me. Then they brought him to Jerusalem, and there he died. Now the children of Judah fought against Jerusalem and took it. They struck it with the edge of the sword and set the on fire. And afterward the children of Judah went down to fight against the Canaanites, who dwelt in the mountains in the south and in the lowland. Then Judah went against the Canaanites, who dwelt in Hebron. The name of Hebron was formerly Kirjath, and they killed Shisha, Aman, and Talmah. Remember those names? From there they went against the inhabitants of Debir. The name of Debir was formerly Kirjath Sepher. Then Caleb said, Whoever attacks Kirjath Sepher and takes it, to him I will give my daughter Ashas as wife. And Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, took it. So he gave him his daughter Ashah as wife. Now it happens when she came to him that she urged him to ask her father for a field. And she dismounted from her donkey, and Caleb said to her, What do you wish? She said to him, Give me a blessing. Since you have given me land in the south, give me also springs of water. And Caleb gave her the upper springs and the lower springs. Now the children of Canaan, Moses' father-in-law, went up from the city of palms with the children of Judah into the wilderness of Judah, which lies in the south near Arad, and they went and dwelt among the people. And Judah went with his brother Simeon, and they attacked the Canaanites who inhabited Zaphath, and utterly destroyed it. So the name of the city was called Hormah. And Judah also took Gaza with its territory, Ashkelon territory, and Ekron with its territory. So the Lord was with Judah, and they drove out the mountaineers. But they could not drive out the inhabitants of the lowland, because they had chariots of iron. And they gave Hebron to Caleb, as Moses had said. Then he expelled from there the 3 sons of Anak. But the children of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites who inhabited Jerusalem. So the Jebusites dwell with the children of Benjamin in Jerusalem to this day. And the house of Joseph also went up against Bethel, and the Lord was with them. So the house of Joseph sent men to spy out Bethel. The name of the city was formerly Luz. And when the spies saw a man coming out of the city, they said to him, "Please show us the entrance to the city, and we will show you mercy." So he showed them the entrance to the city, and they struck the city with the edge of the sword. But they let the man and his family go. And the man went to the land of the Hittites, built a city, and called its name Luz, which is its name to this day. All right, getting a little excitement here, all this stuff going on. All right, so here's what's going on. You'll remember that Moses told the children of Israel that the land would be divided among them. And so when it came time for Joshua to cross the Jordan River, the Bible says that he went, this is in Joshua 13:21, that he went to the high priest, who at that time, according to Josephus, was Phinehas. So he went to the high priest Phinehas, and they went into the door of the tabernacle. Because remember, the tabernacle was still what they were using. Went to the door of the tabernacle, and along with the leaders of each of the 12 tribes. And in the door of the tabernacle, they allotted or cast lots and allotted the land of Canaan to each of the 12 tribes. Right? Now, how was that accomplished? Well, it doesn't tell us, but we do know that anytime the high priest was consulted about something, as far as should we go to battle, should we not, how should we do this, how should we do that, the Bible, or what we learn is that the priest had an oracle, and it was called the Urim and the Thummim. And it was two things that God gave to Aaron. It was part of the high priest, and he was to keep those all the time with him. The Urim and the Thummim. And now how they worked, nobody knows. I mean, but when they asked God a question, the way he answered was through the Urim and the Thummim. And it's kind of like, we wonder about, you go to see a witch doctor, a voodoo person or whatever, and they look in the teacups or they throw something out, oh, that means this or that. It was actually what God gave to Aaron. It was this very same concept of they would roll those out, and through it, it could tell what the Word of God was. Because remember, the high priest was not a prophet, only under Samuel. Otherwise, they weren't.
What were those things?
We don't know.
Oh, okay.
We don't know what they were. That's
That makes me
what I'm
feel
saying.
better.
I mean, you can look it up online, and you'll see Israel, the temple in Jerusalem, like the temple society, will have the Urim and the Thummim. It's what they think it is. It was probably a rock, a couple of rocks marked. I don't know what it was. It wasn't supernatural, but what it was is when they would roll it, what came out of it, God would make it supernatural. You know what I mean? It wasn't some smoky thing come up out of it or something. But how it worked, we don't know. But the point is, they were asking God how to divide Canaan. That's why the priest was there. And so the whole land was divided up, and each tribe was given its land. Now, if you notice, I'm going to read you the 12 tribes. There was Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, Manasseh, Ephraim, and Benjamin. If you add that up, that's 14. Now the reason there was 14 is because the tribe of Joseph was divided into two tribes. Okay, Manasseh and Ephraim. So really there were only 12 tribes, but Joseph was divided into two tribes, two more tribes. So you had the tribe of Joseph, and then you had his two sons, which formed their own tribes. Now, the reason that took place is because when they got ready to go into Canaan, Manasseh said, we want our inheritance on this side of Jordan. We want to be over here. And so Manasseh and Ephraim, or not Ephraim, Gad, I believe, on the back sheet of your thing, you might want to just tear it off so you can reference it. This is how the land was laid out. So you had Manasseh, Gad, and Reuben, that's the three, that said, we want our land on the east side of Jordan. That was not considered part of the promised land. And they told this to Moses, that that's what they wanted. So Moses said, sure, you can have that. Notice Manasseh has land on both the east and west side of the Jordan River.
Yeah.
The big orange when they're yellowish color there. So that explains why we have 14 tribes listed.
Oh.
All right, so when they crossed the Jordan River, they took the city of Jericho. Joshua led the armies, and they conquered a good part of Canaan at that time. Well, now Joshua gets old, and time for Joshua to die, and so he does, like everybody does, I guess. He finally died. And so now what were they going to do? Because Joshua, their leader, was gone, who was going to lead them? If you study the history of Joshua, one thing you find is not only was he one of the spies, him and Caleb were the two spies that came back and said, we can take the land. But you'll also notice that when Moses went into the tabernacle to talk to God, you know who went with him? Joseph. I'm sorry, Joshua, not Joseph. Joseph was long gone. But you will see, you'll see in there where it was Moses and Joshua went into the temple, into the court of the congregation. And that was into the, couldn't go into the holy place, but they went into the court of the congregation, and they would sit there, or the tent of the congregation, they call it, and they would sit there and judge. And the high priest would be there, and when there was a discussion, or they would ask the high priest, he would look at the Urim Thummim, they would come up with the answer that God wanted, and then Moses would take that to the people. So that's how the thing worked. But it was Joshua that was with Moses all the time. Joshua was Moses' right-hand man all the way through the 40 years in the wilderness and all that. He wasn't just some young buck that happened to be a good spy. And we often forget that Joshua was in 40 years of training with Moses. He knew.
Was he a brother or a uncle or a somebody?
No,
No?
not Joshua, no. He was just, well, he may have been one of the tribes of Moses, but no, he was just one of the two tribes, one of the two spies, Caleb being the other. So, when they crossed the river and Joseph died, then the question was, what tribe is going to lead us into battle? What they were saying was, look, Joshua's now gone, and so he was our leader. Which tribe? Because each tribe had its own leader, its own. Which tribe is going to be the primary tribe? Who's going to lead us in battle to take the cities of Canaan? And the Urim and Thummim came up and it said, okay, it's going to be Judah, the tribe of Judah. Now, there's some question about who the high priest was, by the way. Some say it was Phinehas, but it was probably Eleazar, our good friend Eleazar, from the book of Samuel. You remember Samuel as a boy, when God spoke to him, it was Eleazar that said, hey, go to the Lord and said, here am I. I'm here.
Is Eli and Eleazar just the same?
I'm sorry?
Eli Eli and Eleazar?
I'm sorry,
Is,
RDC?
Eli and Eleazar, is that one person?
the same person?
Yeah, Eli.
Yeah, oh, well,
Okay.
yeah, it was Eliezer. is-
Eliezer.
yeah.
So he has a nickname.
Okay. So it was probably Eliezer, since he was one who was with Joseph at the door of the tabernacle when the land was divided. All right, so Judah, he was to lead the tribe in conquering the land. Now, it's interesting here, and I think here we see our first indication of problem. God said to Judah, you lead the nation and conquer the Canaanites. So what does Judah do? He immediately asked his brother Simeon, the tribe of Simeon, to join him in conquest. Did God say anything about Simeon?
no.
So right off the bat, we see this fear that they're not strong enough. Judah is not strong enough to go out and lead the charge and take the land. He's got to have Simeon to help him. So he goes to his brother Simeon and he says, Simeon, I'll tell you what, if you'll help me take my portion of the land, I will help you take your portion. And if you look at the map, you'll notice Simeon is right in the middle of the land that was given to Judah. It's that little piece down toward the bottom. You see the darker orange and then the lighter orange. So it kind of made sense, you know, for Simeon to go with him and go down there and they'd work together and get the job done. But that wasn't what God decreed. So even in their success and God helping them, there was still that matter of fear. We cannot do this, you know, we've got to get together if we're going to do this. So they took off. Now the first battle was at Bezek. Now if you look at your map, Bezek is actually right where you see Ishkar, the red in the middle, there up toward the top. Bezek was right on almost the border between Ishkar and Manasseh. Okay, you don't see it written there. The name isn't there, unfortunately. But that's where it was at. Now, they were taking off from around Jericho. Now, all of Judah's land was south of Jericho. Simeon's land was south of Jericho. And yet they headed north. Why do you think they did that? Well, the reason was because they were leading. They were the first tribe to go out and conquer the Canaanites. Bezek was a city with a king, Adonai, which by the way is a Hebrew word that means Lord or Master. He put himself up as being the Lord. He had already conquered 70 kings in that area. He had cut off their thumbs and cut off their toes. This was, and he did that because that made everybody fear him. You see, Judah had 11 other tribes that had to go through that area in order to get to their land. So Judah, first of all, had to make a way for the rest of the tribes to get up to their land so they could conquer it. That meant taking out the number one enemy, the biggest army that was in Canaan, the most ferocious, the one everybody feared. So the Bible says he went up to Bezek and he defeated Bezek. And he took the king, Adonai Bezek, captive. And he cut off his toes and he cut off his thumbs. Now you think that's terrible. Oh, that's terrible. What they were doing was practicing the law of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, which was part of the law given by God at that time. This guy had been cutting the thumbs and big toes off of every king he defeated. That was against, I realize these were not under the law, but it was against the natural law of God to do that. And we know there was a natural law of God because Paul talks about it in the first 8 chapters or so of Romans. He talks about it. He said, even those who are not under the law understand the law of God in terms of how they're to treat each other. And that's not the way how you treat each other. If you're going to kill somebody, kill them, but don't maim them. Don't gloat over it. Don't make them crawl around under your table for scraps in order to have something to eat. See, that's how terrible this guy was. And so they did the same to him. All right? And then after they had taken Bezek, they headed down to Jerusalem. Now, Jerusalem, again, was not one of the cities of Judah, but it was on the border. But it was for Benjamin. Benjamin was a small tribe. Didn't have a big army. And so they went into Jerusalem and they destroyed Jerusalem. Now, Josephus tells us that they took the lower city very easily. We've been to Jerusalem. We know the lower portion there, below the walls. They took that easy. But when it came to the walls themselves and getting into the upper city, they had a problem. It took them a while to do that. And they may not have, in fact, actually gotten into the point of being able to destroy the city, because we find later the inhabitants were still there. But they were able to burn at least part of the city and destroy it. And while they were there, Bezek died. Now, we don't know if they killed him or if he just died, ran out of blood. I don't know what happened to him. But he died. And that was good. Adonai Bezek.
Yeah,
No more.
so.
Yeah. Died at Jerusalem. And so, also notice, when they captured Bezek, they killed 10,000 Canaanites. That's a lot of people.
Yeah.
A lot of soldiers. And that cleared the way then for the other tribes to move up into their land that was given to them and take their land. All right. Now, after they destroyed Jerusalem, Judah continued south and defeated the Canaanites that lived in the mountainous regions as well as the lowlands. The Canaanites were a people who were very adaptive. They could live in the mountains or they could live in the lowlands. In the lowlands, they grew crops. They were, we've seen the crops out there. At this time, Canaan, remember, was a place that flowed with milk and honey. I mean, these places we look at now is all desert or arid, and you wonder who in the world would ever want to live there. In those times, that's where they had the grapes that were so heavy it took 2 men to carry them on a pole. This was the kind of place it was.
Wow.
And so the Canaanites could be very comfortable as farmers. They were also very comfortable living in the mountains as shepherds with sheep and goats. So they were able to adapt to both of them. So Judah, he headed south, and he went down through into the mountains and the regions of the lowlands. And they went to battle the Canaanites that lived in Hebron. And they killed Shushi, Ammon, and Telmah. Now, who are these guys? What are they in here? What is so important about these guys? We'll find it referenced again a little later in the chapter. These guys were the sons of Anak. Later, as we read, it says that it was Caleb that actually slew the sons of Anak in verse 20. It says, and they gave Hebron to Caleb, as Moses had said. Then he expelled from there the 3 sons of Anak. When it says he expelled them, it means he killed them. Now, who were the 3 sons of Anak? Well, Anak was a descendant of the Nephilim. Now, who were the Nephilim? The Nephilim were the results of the uniting of the sons of God with the daughters of man. These were the angels who we see that are chained, awaiting their execution, if you will, or they're going to be put into the lake of fire. But they're held in chains, and we see them in the book of Jude as being those angels who fell from their first estate. In other words, they looked at the women of men and came down and married them, or whatever. Anyway, the results of that union were the Nephilim. The Nephilim were the giants. And Anak literally came from the ancestors who they termed very tall men. So when we look at Anak and his 3 sons, these were all 3 giants. So it's important to remember that when Caleb came into the land, and the 12 spies came into the land, where they came to was the area of Hebron. And so it was at Hebron that they carried out these huge grapes. That one cluster was so heavy it took 2 men on a pole to bring it out. They said the place flows with milk and honey. You can't believe it. And then they turned around and said, but we'll never take it because there are giants in the land. And it was only Caleb and Joshua that said, we are more than able to take the land. People have wondered, why in the world did Caleb specifically ask Moses for Mount Hebron? Why would he want that area? Huh. It wasn't just because it was a beautiful place, which it was north of Hebron and in that area. Because south of Hebron was a wilderness. Why then did he want it? Because that was the crowning moment of unbelief in the children of Israel. I firmly believe that Caleb said, I want to go where nobody else wanted to go. And I want to prove that God is who he says he is. And I'm going to take that mountain. Now remember, Caleb was 80 years old by now. Because it says he was in his 40s when he went in as a spy, and they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. So Caleb was over 80 years old, and he says, I am going to take that mountain. He didn't say, I'm going to send my kids up there. I'm going to send. I am going to go take that mountain. Give me that mountain. I want to go throw the giants out myself. If those other 10 guys were chicken and didn't believe God, I believe God. I'm going to go take that mountain. And he did. He did. These were the giants, and he slew them. You know, when we just let God do his thing, things work out. When we get in the way of God, things don't work out very well. So the land of Hebron was promised to Caleb, and so Judah gave it to Caleb. So he had both the mountains and the very arid lowlands. So he had the mountains, he had the arid land as well as the well-cultivated land. So he had all of that. Now, after they left there, they went to Debar, and it was there that Caleb, you remember Caleb was a part of Judah, by the way. It was there that Caleb challenged the leaders of the army. And he said, anyone who can defeat Debar, I'm going to give him my wife. It makes you want, I'm going to give him my daughter, not my wife. I'm going to give him my daughter to wife, to be their wife. And it makes you wonder what the daughter looked like. You know, first thing that passes my mind is, You mean he couldn't marry her off any other way? I mean, I don't know. But I'm sure she was a beautiful girl, and we do know that she was intelligent. Let me tell you that. So anyway, his nephew steps up, and he says, I'll go do it. So Othniel, his nephew, defeated the city, and Caleb gave his daughter to Othniel. He didn't give his wife, come on.
Sister
She was an old lady who won her by that time. So anyway, he gave Othniel his daughter, and his daughter came to Othniel and said, as part of the dowry, because in those days they had to give a dowry, you know, as part of the dowry we want land. Now we don't see where Othniel talked to Caleb about that. That's not recorded. But we do know that it happened, because it says she came to her husband and said, asked my father for some land. And that would be unspoken, but part of the dowry, for some land. So they did, and Caleb gave him land. But she got to thinking, the land he gave us is down south of Mount Hebron. It's on the wilderness side. And if we're going to be successful, we have to make sure that the water is given to us also. You know, we've seen the areas there, and they rely heavily on the water and being able to channel water down. And so Caleb gave her, and Othniel also, two things. He gave him the upper and the lower springs. Now, when we were in Israel, one thing we learned when we were up at Philippi, that's the start of the Jordan River up there. And the water, when it rains in those mountains because of the rock, it takes forever for that water to seep down through that rock. What did he say? Sometimes it takes years for some of that water? I don't remember exactly.
Years.
Yeah, it takes a long time for the rainwater that lands on the mountains to go down through all the aquifer and finally come out as a stream. But it is extremely pure when it comes out. It's well filtered. And I remember looking at that water, there's a little stream coming out of here, you know, it's not even as wide hardly as that table, and that's the start of the Jordan River. But it's pure. I mean, you can, yes, you can just, you just want to take a big drink of it, you know, I mean, it just looks so good. That was the upper springs. Now these ran most of the year, not just in the rainy season, because it took so long for that water to get down through there that it's mingled year after year, and it just keeps building up, and finally it comes out of spring. So these springs run pretty much year round. So that was the upper springs. The lower springs were the wells. And the lower springs are what they call the Nether spring in the King James. These were the ones where you had to have some kind of a contraption to get the water up to pour it out into the canals. And that would be something you would have in the really arid, most southern part of your land. You'd have to dig a well. So that was what was going on here. What she was asking for is water so she could grow crops year-round and be successful. Point being, they weren't planning on pitching a tent and taking off the next day. They wanted to stay there, inhabit, and do what God had said to do in the first place. And that was inhabit the land. Caleb did everything that God said to do. He didn't have to have help. I don't see in here where it says he went out and he called Gad and Dan and Reuben and said, hey, you guys come over here and help me. We're going to run these giants out of here. He just says he did it.
Mm-hmm.
He took his family and he walked in there and he killed the giants, and he just did it. Why? God said do it. Okay, I'm going to do it. Good enough for me. I've got it. All right, so after the defeat of the giants, and we ran them out, we now jump up and we learn about the family of Kenite. Now, Kenite was the father-in-law of Moses. And he was evidently in Jericho, around the area of Jericho. And you remember when they defeated Jericho and the walls came down, Joshua pronounced a curse on the area. He said, this place is never going to be built again, and Jericho will never be Jericho again. Jericho means the city of palms. So to differentiate where Kenite was staying, he was staying around the city of palms, which would be Jericho. Now there's a problem there. Why was he staying around the city that Joshua had cursed and said no one should live here? Why was he there? Why didn't he move off to another location? Why didn't he follow the armies? Why didn't he do something else? Why did he stay there? Ah, red flag goes up. God said, I don't want anybody living here in Jericho. And what's Kenite doing? He's living there. So he takes off from there, and he goes into the desert down below Mount Hebron, which was the area that Caleb had given to his nephew. Around that area. I don't mean it was probably the same land, but it was in that area. They went down, they took over the country, and they lived there. There's only one little slight problem. It says they lived there with the inhabitants.
Where are you, Brother Steve? I got lost.
Well, this is my my notes, so you probably won't find it, but you'll find it in the readings.
16, okay. Janine showed me.
In verse 16.
Yeah.
They went up from the city of palms with the children of Judah into the wilderness of Judah, which lies in the south near Arad, and they went and dwelt among the people. Oops, another red flag. Why did they dwell among the people? God said, deport them all.
Yeah.
God said, kill them all. Whatever it took, get them out of the land. This was to be a complete purging of the land of Canaan. Wow. And here is Canaan. He goes down, Canaanite, and he moves in with them. First problem. Now Judah and Simeon, they went on to conquer Zephad, Gaza, Ashkelon, and Ekron with all of their territories. So they went down, conquered them all. It says God was with Judah and Simeon, and they were able to drive all the inhabitants out of the mountains. However, verse 19, they could not drive out the inhabitants of the lowland because they had chariots of iron. So we have the Canaanites living in the mountains. They're able to go up and run all of them out. They can defeat them. They can run all the inhabitants out of the land that lived in the mountains. But when it came to the valleys, they couldn't take the ones in the valleys. Why? Because they had chariots of iron. That'd be like saying, we can't go take them because they got tanks. And we only have, pistols and rifles. How are we going to take anything against a tank? But you remember I said when we started looking at Judah that there was something wrong there. There was a fear. While they believed God could help them, there was a limit to what God could do. We're going to be going down into the land of giants, and so I'm going to ask Simeon, tribe of Simeon, come help us. We're going to need some help. God didn't say you need help. He just said, go and do it. And here we see they're able to take the mountains, but when it came to the lowlands, they looked at those chariots. Oh, there's no use. They're going to run over us with those things. You know, these chariots had horses, and Israel didn't have any horses. I mean, they're on foot. And they're going to run those horses at us, and they're going to be shooting arrows off of those chariots, and they're going to be throwing spears at us, and they're just going to cut us to pieces. We just don't have a chance. It never says they engaged any of these Canaanites or Pezerites. It could have been the Pezerites. We don't know for sure who they were, by the way. But the term seems to be dwellers of unwalled cities. And the cities on the plains were often unwalled because they had chariots. They didn't need to build these huge walls and all of that. They just send their chariots out after anybody who wanted to attack them, and that was, they just wipe them out. And so they were unable to take the lowlands. And this is what's going to lead to a lot of the problems that Israel is going to experience in the book of Judges, because they did not take care of these lowland tribes. All right. Now we hear another interesting character, and that is, we learned that Judah gave Hebron to Caleb. But we learn about the tribe of Benjamin in verse 21. The tribe of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites who had returned to Jerusalem, and so they lived with the tribe of Benjamin as of the writing of the book of Judges. We've been to Jerusalem, right? And what was one of the most outstanding things to you guys, at least to me, when we were walking around the old city? When you look at it. It was all the sections. We're in the Jewish section. Oh, we're over in the Palestinian section. Oh, we're in the Armenian section. And these are separate sections within the city, and if you're in the Jewish section, you're under Jewish law. If you're in the Palestinian section, you're under Palestinian law. If you're in the Armenian section, you're under Armenian law. The city is divided. Even today. Even today. And I think it's still divided as a way of God saying, look, when I tell you to do something, thousands of years ago, you should have done it. If you'd have done it, we wouldn't have this today.
Yeah.
It's amazing to me. Even though Jerusalem was completely destroyed, even though it was burned down in 70 AD by Rome, it's been rebuilt. I mean, it's put back together. The Byzantines came in, rebuilt the walls. It still has the same sections in it. And what's the big problem in Israel today? The Palestinians versus Israelis, the Mount of, and the Mosque of Omar, where the temple is supposed to be up there, and they got the Jews at the bottom down here praying on the old wall, and up there's the temple of Omar, and you're walking down through these streets, and you don't know which law to obey because you're not sure which part you're in. Where are we? And then up comes Israel, and they say, okay, now we just changed. Jerusalem's now our capital. And so all the liberals are hollering and screaming, yeah, this is a terrible thing, And we saw the council. It was the day after it opened, I think. We were right there. Saw it. The U.S. consulate. That was a big thing. Oh, we're recognizing all because Benjamin didn't do what God said to do.
Wow.
It was easier to walk in and say, hey, look, let's just be friends. We'll just be friends. We'll live together, and we'll be friends. We'll trade, and we'll work, and we'll do things together, and everything will be fine. And it was for a long time. But that tells us something. God said, come out from among them and be ye separate. And that doesn't mean that we're going to go off and live in some place, a ranch out here all by ourselves, or we're going to be, we're going to wear all these special clothes, or we can't live this way or can't look that way. But what it means is we serve a different kingdom. And when we serve that kingdom, that means we have to have allegiance to that kingdom. It has to be first in everything that we do. If it isn't first, then we're mixing what God said not to mix with. When we allow our own ideas to take over what God says, we're mixing. And we're going to see this a little more as we move through here. All right, so now we come to, and by the way, according to Josephus, Benjamin allowed the inhabitants of Jerusalem to pay taxes. Instead of running them out, okay, well, you just pay us tribute, taxes, and everything will be fine. And so they did. Unfortunate thing is that we're going to find that the other tribes followed the lead of Benjamin and not the lead of Judah, and allowed the inhabitants to pay taxes instead of leaving Canaan. When we make a compromise and we look at it through the eyes of the world, in this case Benjamin, tribe of Benjamin, they started getting money. Remember, Jerusalem was a trade route area, so all four roads came right by Jerusalem. So it was a trade center. It was a place where they had a lot of wealth coming through there. They were paying taxes to Benjamin. Benjamin was getting rich. And so the other tribes looked at Benjamin and said, hey, look at what Benjamin, they got a thing going. And we'd be crazy to run these people out of here. Why? We'll just let them stay, and they just pay us. And we're just going to collect all this wealth. Woo! God's delivered all of this wealth into our hands. Yeah. He might even use that scripture that I used yesterday. Yeah. That he's delivered the wealth of the wicked into your hands. Well, I don't know. We'll see. All right, now we find about the house of Joseph, which, by the way, is probably Ephraim in this point. So the house of Joseph went up against the town of Bethel, and they sent spies out. And what the spies were doing here, they didn't have any trouble finding the front gate. If you read this, what's the entrance into the city? If I sent spies out and they couldn't find the gate to the city, I think I would question my spies. These guys they're blind, or they're just not very much with it. What they were asking is, what is the easiest way into the city? We're going to bring an army in. What's the easiest way in? And they found this guy, came outside the city, and they talked to him, and they said, look, here's the deal. We're going to cut a deal with you. See, everybody in this city is going to die. We're going to kill them all. Now, you show us the easiest way in here, and you and your family will let you go. Okay? Good compromise. So he did. He showed them the easiest way in. And so they went in, sure enough, destroyed the city, killed everybody in the city, and they let that man and his family go. Now this city had the name of Luz. And so what he did, he headed to the land of the Hittites. The land of the Hittites was way north of Galilee. It was clear up on the border up there. And out of the land of Canaan. And he built a city, and he called it Luz. I just kind of laughed at that one. I thought, well, he let him go, and he's going to go build another city, just like it. But the thing I think to note here is that, yeah, they didn't kill him, they let him go, but he left the land of Canaan. He went to the land of the Hittites, out of the land of Canaan. And that's what God said, drive them out of the land of Canaan. So they were well within God's mandate in doing this. What I'm trying to show here is that we can do things like make this kind of an offer, this kind of a compromise, as long as we stay within the parameters that God has said. Now, if they had made that same offer and said, now, we'll let you go and you can just go over here a couple of cities and live over there, you'll be fine. That would have been against the will of God. But by him leaving Canaan, they were within the will of God. So this is some of the guidelines that we're going to find as we move through the book of Joshua. We can do things as long as we stay within those guidelines. By the way, the word Luz means almond tree. I thought that was kind of funny.
Oh, yeah?
All right. Now, this last section was the incomplete conquest of the land. Judges 1:27-36. It says this, however, Manasseh did not drive out the inhabitants of Beth Shean and its villages, or Tanakh and its villages, or the inhabitants of Dor and its villages, or the inhabitants of Iblim and its villages, or the inhabitants of Megiddo and its villages, or the Canaanites for the Canaanites were determined to dwell in that land. Oh, okay. You want to stay here that bad, I guess we'll just let you stay. By the way, you pay us taxes and we'll leave you alone. We'll become rich. Yeah, that'll be cool. Verse 28, and it came to pass when Israel was strong. That meant when they were strong in the will of God, strong in the help of God, that they put the Canaanites under tribute but did not completely drive them out. When God would make them strong, when God gave them the power, they still didn't do it. They wanted that money, so they put them under taxes. Nor did Ephraim drive out the Canaanites who dwelt in Gezer, so the Canaanites dwelt in Gezer among them. Nor did Zebulun drive out the inhabitants of Kidron, or the inhabitants of Nahalo, or so the Canaanites dwelt among them, and they were put under tribute. See? Nor did Asher drive out the inhabitants of Akko, or the inhabitants of Sidon, or Olive, or Azeb, Helbah, Ephek, or Rehob. In other words, they didn't do anything.
Right.
So the Asherites dwelt among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land, for they did not drive them out. Nor did Naphtali drive out the inhabitants of Beth Shemesh, or the inhabitants of Beth Anath, for they dwelt among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land. Nevertheless, the inhabitants of Beth Shemesh and Beth Anath were put under tribute to them. And the Amorites forced the children of Dan into the mountains, for they would not allow them to come down to the valley. What? What? Now you talk about having no faith. Dan had to be 0 on the scale of belief. Not only could they not defeat him, they ran them up into the mountains. They didn't even let them come down to the valleys. And the Amorites were determined to dwell in Mount Heres, in Ajalon, and Cherubim. Yet when the strength of the house of Joseph became greater, they were put under tribute. Ephraim again. When Ephraim became great, powerful, they helped Dan and came down and put the Amorites under tribute. They didn't run them off. They just put them under tribute. Hey, Dan, all right, we understand you need money. You've been up in the mountains hiding out, and you're a poor tribe, so we'll help you And now they will pay you tribute, because if they don't, we'll come over and stomp them.
Wow.
Verse 36 says, now the boundary of the Amorites was from the ascent of Akrabim, from Selah and upward. Now, this has nothing to do with the story, other than it marks the southern border of Judah. This ascent of Akrabim, Akrabim means scorpions. And on the east side of the Sea of not the Sea of Galilee, but the Dead Sea, just south of the Dead Sea, marks the boundary line for Judah and Israel. And this was a slope that went from below the Dead Sea all the way up to this area. Can't think of the name of the city, but it's on the east side of the lake, the east side of the Jordan River. And if you look at a map, you'll see where that thing is. And it's actually a little valley thing, and it looks like it's got scorpions in it. It's rocks, and it's called the Ascent of the Scorpions. And I'm sure there's scorpions there, by the way, since that's a pretty arid place. But it actually goes from the sea level of the Dead Sea all the way up to a higher area where, we saw the mountains on the east side of the Sea of Galilee. You see all those mountains. And you remember where they were shooting down at the Israeli farmers, from up on that. Well, it goes from there up into that range. So this is a gentle slope, and it was one way they could get up there very easily. So caravans would go that way, and it was pretty easy trek. But that also formed the boundary line between Israel and the Amorites. Now, today, that is the same boundary line between Israel and Jordan. They use that same boundary line, so it hasn't changed. So that's really the only important there. It's interesting also that Dan was driven into the mountain from the inhabitants of the plain. That tells me they probably had chariots of steel. That's probably why Dan couldn't go down there. They were afraid of the chariots of steel. It's interesting that I wonder what would have happened if they really had spiritual eyes. You remember the story of Elijah, when he was up on the mountain and he was scared to death, or he wasn't. He was sleeping, in fact. The Bible says he was up there completely relaxed, and his servant was just going nuts. We're going to die. Ahab's coming with all of his armies. He's going to kill us up here. And Elijah's just sitting back looking at him like, you got to be kidding me. You got to be kidding me. Elijah, Ahab and his armies? Well, it would take Ahab and his armies, the Amalekites, the Pizarites, the Canaanites, it would have to take all of them to come up here, and they still couldn't kill us. There's two of us. What else do we need? That's And it was finally until Elijah got tired of hearing his servant whining, and he said, God, just open his eyes. And when his eyes are open, what did he see? A multitude of soldiers. Thousands of soldiers all around them. You see, Elijah saw the soldiers. He saw through spiritual eyes that God has an army that is so strong, so mighty, that I don't care if it's tanks, airplanes, bombers, hydrogen bombs, it doesn't matter. You're going to blow a hydrogen, go ahead, drop it and see what happens. That angel will walk up there and say, well, look at this thing. Well, isn't that fun? Mm-hmm. Really? That's what we're talking about. If Israel had have only believed God, if Dan had just said, God said it, Unlike Caleb, we're gonna go destroy these guys and started down there. What they would have found, the wheels would have fallen off the chariots, the horses would have fallen over dead,
Right,
the
yeah.
bowstrings would have broke, you know, there would have been a deluge from heaven that flooded them all out. I don't know what God would have done. But I know he's got an army that's greater than any army anybody can put together. We don't have to fear anything in this life. Because he is there, he will bring what is necessary to take care of the issue. You remember when the Assyrians came against Israel and they were going to destroy them. And God told the king, you know, they went fasting and tore their clothes and they were down with sackcloth and ashes before God. And God said, what are you doing? Just don't worry about it. I got this. Don't worry about it. I got it. And they woke up in the morning, looked out there was over 100,000 Assyrian soldiers dead. Overnight. You know, just go get the spoils. Just go out there and collect whatever you want. Because they've been hauling, they've been destroying cities. They had carts full of gold and silver and all the stuff that the spoils of battle. Just go take it. It's all yours. That's the God that we serve. And what we're going to see in Joshua is the absolute, I'm going to say, stupidity of these people in not understanding that God could always not only deliver them, but keep them. They trusted him to deliver them when they were in trouble. They didn't trust him to keep him when they weren't. That's it. We're done for the day. I told you I'd keep it pretty good.
Wow.
All right, next week.